To hook or not to hook? The great debate on React class components versus hooks today on CloudDev Clarity. Hey, AC, how are ya?
Doing good. Yourself, Julie?
We're doing really good. Today is the big day. The thing that we've been foreshadowing for quite a while. I think people are anticipating that this conversation is the big battleground, put them up. Yeah. I've been practicing, jabbing. Like that's part of my workout in the morning. I just don't want it to be that. So absolutely, I don't think we need to. I think we have different perspectives on this topic, but I think they're all valid and there's no right or wrong answer. And I think that's what we're going to maybe get to in the end when we get through this whole topic. But yeah. We
reached out to some people ahead of time. So we had kind of an open chat on the Discord channel for this. If you're not familiar with what we're talking about with Discord, check the link in the notes below. But we have a way, or in the description below the video. But there's a way that you can join the Voitanos Discord community, and we have a whole section set up where we we post a forum post on the next episode we're going to go with. And invite people to have what are your questions? What kind of things do you want? What questions do you want answered? And I know that, we'll explain some of those and we'll have a goal of getting through all of those questions that are relevant to our discussion here. But I think that one of the reasons that you and I wanted to really do this, or that selfishly, one of the reasons I really want to do it too, was because I find that the question comes up and there's a lot of confusion on what React hooks are and what they're supposed to replace. And then because they don't understand the what and the why they were introduced, I think that there's a lot of waterfall misunderstandings or misunderstandings after that or preconceived notions that don't apply, that are all based on this false waterfall of assumptions that they've made early on.
100% agree with that. 100% agree with that. I think that's definitely the case.
You could definitely see that in those questions that we got. I could definitely see it. Yeah.
Yep. So should we start by defining what we're talking about in a little more detail?
I got
starting with what's your idea?
What about if we throw the questions out that people were asking us on Discord? We don't answer them now, but let's throw them out there and let's see. So you'll find out what questions we're going to answer throughout the show, and then we'll go back to the very end and we'll be like, did we get it? Yep. Nope. Oh,
okay. All right. Yeah. All right. Okay. I like that. Okay. So some of them were why and why not to use hooks, right? So that was definitely, and I can totally see where that question is useful. Is there any performance impacts? That's an interesting question. Mm-hmm. When to use them? And I think we're definitely going to be able to cover that. And then our hooks, for reusable things for an entire component, like our classes for one thing and components for, hooks for another thing. Where's that breaking point if there is one? So those are generally the questions that we got posed, and we're going to try to address all of those.
Yeah, and sprinkle in a bunch of our opinions and
sprinkle in our opinions. No, we just are going to have different opinions. I think.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the other thing I think we should say too, right up front, is this is not about shaming somebody. You use what you want to use. Yeah, no, I will not be shamed by you, sir.
Oh, not you. I'm thinking about other people.
Oh, here we go. All right. All right. So let's start class components. Let's just start with the fact that class components are how I develop my React components and how I like to do things. And I have a particular reason why that works for me. But I think the biggest one is, so a class component is essentially defining a class that's in usually its own file, but it doesn't have to be, defining a class that is a React component. And so what that ends up being is that it ends up being like an HTML tag that you then use that instantiates the functionality you enclosed in that component class. And so you inherit from React.component or React.pure component, and that creates your little molecule of functionality or your atom of functionality. within that component, that React component. So functional components, why don't you do the honors since you like them?
So, well, all a functional component is that you're just creating an object, but you're not using like the class nomenclature. You're creating an object that's got functions on it. That's going to, when you actually instantiate it, it's going to return something the same way that a class it has a constructor. It works the same way, right? To me, they're the same. They're effectively the same thing from the consumer point of view. So I know that a lot of people that watch this are SharePoint framework or like Microsoft 365 developers. This is not we're not going to be specific to that, but just for as an understanding, you build a web part, has nothing to do with React, and you're going to add in what looks like a funky HTML tag or a non-standard HTML tag into your render method on a web part, and it's going to render. From your point of view as the web part developer, you have no idea if that's a class component or if that's a functional component. It's just an object.
Exactly. Right.
So
exactly
what hooks are is that there's a more functional development differs from the class-based approach, where you have similar things. You still got functions. You still have or methods. You still have public properties and stuff like that. But functional development or functional like scripting is like more traditional JavaScript stuff. The class approach it came like after when we started doing like JavaScript scripting. Like originally when you looked at a lot of the jQuery stuff and everything, that was when jQuery was a big thing. I guess you could argue it still is. That it was all still very much functional component or functional like thing, functional objects you were building, functional components. Yep. And they weren't building class-based stuff. TypeScript really helped people push over this whole like, I'm in a more managed language kind of mindset and object-oriented. Yep. And so they brought a lot of the object-oriented capabilities to the JavaScript world. All hooks, all functional components is just a different way of developing things and of writing your objects. And I think that one of the things that the reason why we have React hooks is that prior to being able to have React hooks, we had a hard way of doing React to be able to hook into things like in the page life or in the component lifecycle. So things like component did mount or component will mount or did unmount or stuff like that, and properties changed. Yep. Those were all class-based methods that we would override from the class that we were based on, from the abstract class. And we had no way of we didn't have there wasn't no way, but it made doing functional development with React very hard without having access to those page lifecycle methods and being able to create like side effects and stuff like that. What hooks does is all it does is it's a way of doing React, but it makes it to where you can build your React components as a functional component instead of a class component, a more traditional class component. If you've heard of terms like higher order component or an HOC, that's the class style way of doing it. When you hear hooks, it's kind of synonymous with functional component.
Right. And as a sort of a cross pollination thing, Bob German and I did a browser native session specifically on how class components are now supported in the vanilla JavaScript or out of the box JavaScript. So it's definitely something that has come to the browser to have classes, but there's definitely a mindset, right? You are you are generally of the mindset where maybe if you're coming from like a .NET C# background, classes make inherent sense to you, where if you are coming from vanilla JS and maybe learning TypeScript or whatever, functional style programming is absolutely more obvious, right? I think that is definitely a different differentiator.
Yeah, it's totally fair. Yeah, it's going to be a bit of an eye of the beholder, right? But I don't think one of them is better than the other one. This is where we're going to start to have our opinions kind of differ on things. Where
exactly?
I don't know who wants to go first here. Do you want me to do my opinion, or do you want to do yours first? Ladies first.
Yeah, I'll start because so here's the background on where I'm coming from.
Where everybody thinks we're going to fight.
Right, exactly. So my background on this is we've talked about this in our intro videos or whatever. React sort of came on the spotlight for us with the introduction of the SharePoint framework. And you and I were both Angular developers at that time, meaning that was our go-to kind of client-side development framework that we would use. And then when SharePoint framework came on the scene and it took a out of the box dependency on React, meaning that the first party components that are being built by Microsoft are built with React. Therefore, React is already loaded on the page. You just get to this point where you're like, why am I trying to swim upriver with trying to load some other framework onto the page, adding extra weight, adding extra bloat, when I can just use the framework that's already loaded on the page and make use of that. So coming from that, we were sort of pre-hooks being introduced. And so everybody was writing class components. That was the way to do it. And coming from writing code in a very MVC or MVVM type of methodology, I have always architected my client-side code from the perspective of the view model or the UI or the place where I render my HTML and CSS is only in charge of the view. So any methods and functionality that I have in there, it is to support like button clicking or any kind of user interactivity with the page. And everything else that I need to do, I'm used to architecting into a service where I would put all of that business logic or data fetching functionality into some central code situation, which is either maybe a singleton or not, depending on the pattern, the architectural pattern that I need, and centralizing that kind of code. Even if back in the Angular days, I actually did a talk on the architecture of building sort of that MVVM type of style of architectural separation. Services were, part of AngularJS back in the day. I mean, it was a pattern that they embraced. And so I kind of have that pattern. And so when hooks came out, I was of this mind, okay, well, let's see what this is about. And to me, looking at functional programming style, although I can do it, it's not clean like I like. It's a very OCD kind of opinion, but it's sort of like I have this ability to like look at a class component and quickly my eye is just trained to see what that thing is doing. It's just, I have a way of seeing it that just makes that really quick and I know what that is. Whereas when I look at functional components and like use effect and those kinds of things, I feel like I'm trying to look between the code into the middle of the page to try to tease out, what are the state properties here? What are the events? What is happening with the page? And I find it just much harder to read. Doesn't make it better or worse, it just makes it different. So the only argument I've ever heard for where the hooks are better than the class components is what you just described, which is the issue with the state of, attaching to those state event models, like should component update, has component mounted, la 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 la. I don't ever we talked about this before, 99% of my code never even touches those. I just don't even need to think about them. So it was never really an onus for me to sort of pick that up. So my opinion was, since this doesn't give me any benefit, why would I throw out all that historical code that I have that I can leverage for reuse, right? I have my snippets of code and my coding style, and I can code extremely quickly in this style. So why would I throw it all out? So I think that's sort of where I came from, with no benefit that I could see. Yeah. So that was my sort of baseline.
So
my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm totally fair, right? And it is. I think it does. A lot of it does come down to. So I guess for me, it comes down to a couple different things. I would encourage everybody to, first of all, I'd encourage everybody to at least try it. Right. So try it, because you don't know if when I kept like looking at the code for working with hooks, I found that I had a little bit of a, it's kind of like learning TypeScript when you're switching from JavaScript. Like I looked at it and I was like going, yeah, I get it, but I don't really know. I don't really see where the value really is yet. And it wasn't until I forced myself to say, all right, this project is only going to be TypeScript, no JavaScript at all. I'm going to force myself to use TypeScript, and I'm not going to put everything as an any, right? I'm going to actually go through and really try and go through and really type everything and really leverage the language. And it wasn't until I did that with hooks that I started to really to grok the benefit. And so for me, I like it for a couple different reasons. So first and foremost, I feel like I write a lot less code. And I mean, I've looked at stuff that I've had to port from using the class-based approach to using the hooks-based approach. And to me, I write a heck of a lot less. So like I wrote a bunch of Microsoft learning modules for Microsoft on Teams development. And it was using the Yo Teams, the Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams, a community tool. And for the longest time, that was all based on using class-based components for React.
Right.
They did an update to their project where everything was now hooks based. And so I had to sit there and port everything in the modules over to hooks because that's what everybody was going to be seeing when they started doing the modules. And I found that when I did that, I was able to delete a lot more code of stuff that I was writing before. Most specifically, it's around working with state. And so before, like with React, if you want to do something with state and you want to update a state value, but you have to use the previous state value as one of the in the calculation of the new state. So something very simple. If you're going to do a counter, right? I'll mention this video that I did that I've published recently. That has this as an example. But basically, like, let's just say you have a counter and you have a button that when I click the button, I want the counter to increment by 1 and I want to show in the UI. Well, naturally, I have to get the current value of that counter before I increment it by 1. And to do that 100%. In the class-based approach, I would use the this.setState. But I would have to use the implementation of that method that passed in the previous state to where I could then, because state's immutable. So then I'd have to take the old state, create a brand new, a copy of it as a new state, and then use the old value in the counter to increment it by 1 and then return that back as the new state.
Yeah, for sure. That is, you want to clone, your state variable, set it to like a local one in the method, and then do whatever, change it, and then reset it back. Absolutely. Yes, that is the pattern. So
right. Because I mean, it stays immutable. And so you can't go through and you can't mutate it. So I'm like, okay, well, I found that with hooks, you don't have to do that, because with hooks, when you define a new state property, unlike with class-based components and working with state, you create like one state object. It's a big interface not big, but it's an interface that you define as part of the declaration of the object. And all the properties that are in that state are inside of that interface. Whenever you want to mutate the state or whenever you want to change the state, you've got to return back in a brand new state object every time. Okay, that's fine. However, with hooks, what's different is that you now have a hook where you're hooking into something into React. And so for me, or not for me, for everybody, there's a hook called useState, and it returns back two things. It returns back whatever the object is that you define, so counter, and then it returns a method that is essentially the callback that says, here's the thing you're going to use to change that state property. So generally the pattern is, if I have a state value called counter, then the method is going to be called setCounter. And it takes one parameter in, it's a number. You can initialize and all that stuff. So that now when I want to go through and change the state, I don't have to worry about what the previous value was, because I can just say I can say setCounter and then say counter +1 as the parameter going in. I don't have to worry about the previous state, because it's like a public member, a class-based member. Yeah,
they're giving you a getter and a setter essentially.
Right. Yeah. So that's one big thing, is I feel like, okay, that's a lot less code. The other thing that I like, and this kind of addresses the point that you had a second ago, and this is the part that I think that it's going to be hard for people to understand this until you actually give it a shot. And I tried to show this in this video. But the thing that, not this video, the one that I'll refer to in a minute. The thing that I like about it is that, so when something happens in your component, And I don't mean like a button click or something like that. All of that stuff works the exact same way between both of them.
Absolutely.
Like if it's an on-click handler, they all work the same.
Yep.
But one of the things in terms of like defining your button and defining the function that's going to then run when you click the button, inside of it is where you can start leveraging the hook stuff where it's like, set counter, whatever. The thing that I like about it though, is that with hooks is that we can define things called side effects. And so a side effect is that when this happens, or when this changes, or when these change, any of these change, then I want to go run some code. And so I can use another hook called use effect. So otherwise known as use side effect, but there's no side in there. So it's like I only use effect to go run the following code. And then the second parameter you pass into it is an array. It's an optional parameter you pass in, but it's an array of all the state properties that if any of them change, then I want this code to run. And so what I like about that is that if I, back to your example, that it's easier to kind of see what's going on. If I collapse everything down to just the function declarations, I can look at all the different declarations of where use effect is defined and look at the second parameter and just be like, if any of these things change, then I know that this code's going to run. And there's a similar way to implement the what is it called on component did mount or component will mount or component props did change or something, whatever it is. Yep. But those two lifecycle methods, there's a way to go through and leverage use effect to do the same thing where you don't pass any parameters in. And that basically tells React going, this isn't based on anything. You're only going to run this when you initialize. You're never going to run it any other time. Right. Yep. What's kind of cool about this too is that there's something baked into it where, unlike with class components, it keeps you from being non-performant. Because with class-based components, every time you call set state, it's going to re-render the component.
Assuming you want it to.
But every time you call set state, it's going to do that, right? If you change the state,
that particular inside of the state associated with that component, yes, it will re-render.
Right. So for the scope of that component, if you call set state this.set state correct. Inside the scope of that component, if you call it 5 times, it's going to re-render the component 5 times.
That's correct. Yes.
When you're doing it with hooks, when you call the set whatever, so in my case, set counter, or I guess the other one I have is set even odd is another property I have, that when those things are called, even if I call them in succession, React has a little bit of like an internal timer that's batching those things together. You think they're synchronous, but they're not exactly synchronous. It can batch up the state changes together so that they all change at once. And then it will go through and do the component re-rendering one time. So that's, to me, I find that number one, I like it because I find out to write less code. 2, I find it to be, I can be more expressive about what I want to do. Whereas I feel like when I moved to React from Angular, I felt that I was being much more deliberate about everything that I wanted to have happen. I felt like I was much more imperative of like teaching a 10-year-old on what chores you've got to go do. Like, here's a list, go do these things. When I come back, you better have these things done in this order.
Yeah, because of the way the binding worked within Angular. Yeah, it was like that two-way binding thing. So you really didn't have to think about it in the same way. That was absolutely the hardest part about switching to React, was sort of thinking like changing your mindset about how you would write your code to make sure that when you set state, everything was done. I have to totally agree with you there.
It's more like React to me at the time when we were switching from Angular to React. I felt like Angular was much more imperative instructions on here's what you're going to do, where React was much more expressive. Like, here's what I want. Here's how I want it to work. You figure it out.
Right.
I have the same feel when I switch to hooks. Now the class component way of doing hooks to me feels much more imperative. Whereas now I feel like hooks is even a step further in that expressive, just like, go clean your room. I'm not going to come in there and tell you, make your bed, put all the dirty clothes in the hamper, take the dishes downstairs, put them in the dishwasher. I don't feel like I'm doing that as much.
You clearly do not have my 10-year-old as a son.
Oh no, I have a 13-year-old. I still end up doing it. A 17-year-old, I'm still doing that kind of stuff. But I mean, I'm just, I can tell my wife that, hey, look, we need to get this done. She's like, okay, I get it all done. That just means, okay, cool, we made dinner. But
so when we're speaking to other adults, yes, I understand. Yeah, okay. We just have to change that paradigm a little.
She may disagree when you ask her the same thing about her giving me instructions. So I may be the child, but I digress. So to me, those are some of the benefits to it. And if you're interested in seeing kind of the difference here, I did. So I have a video that I've recently published, and there's a blog post that goes along with it. But I tried to make it as basic as I could with this, to where it's like, if you've never done anything. Honestly, the audience is SharePoint framework developers, because these are the people I usually find going, I can't do hooks. Why can't I do hooks? Because the thing that the Yeoman generator for the SharePoint framework, it always creates class components. Right. And so what I did was I broke the video into two parts. It's a relatively short-ish video, like 10 to 15 minutes, or about 15-ish minutes, something like that. And what it does is it says, you've created a brand new web part project, You've got a single web part in it. It's a React-based web part. You want to convert it to be able to use hooks. That means you got to convert to a functional component. Here's what you have to do. Literally takes about 10, 15 seconds. Okay, now let's start taking it to the next level. How do we go through and start leveraging hooks? All right, let's use the hook use state. Update the template. Now let's add an event handler to a button. So when you click the button, it increments a counter, shows on the screen. But then I want to show, well, then how do I go through and do how do I implement a side effect for this? So you're going to use the state, you're going to use the hook use effect to say, whenever the counter state property changes, go run this code. And this code says, let's look at the counter. And if it's even or odd, set the state on another property that will also have in the rendering. And then the third piece that it does is a common scenario of, how do I initialize this stuff? And I show like, well, here's how you go initialize, go get data from the SharePoint REST API and show a list of all the lists in the current SharePoint site. So it's very basic. It's very simple. The video walks through all the pieces to it, and the blog post does like the diff. I love,
since I have an early preview, I love how you wrote the blog post to really show the exact things that are changing. It looks like a GitHub pull request. So it's really nice in that way, where you're like, oh, I know what this is, but it's in red. And here's the green that replaces that. And they're right next to each other. And that makes it really easy to sort of consume as somebody who, hey, if you want to embrace this, which, full disclosure, there's nothing like we're of this. We have different sides of this, but I think the thing that we were trying to say at the beginning is there's no shame in either. You can use either one. In the end, it's all going to transpile down to plain JavaScript, and it's not going to make really any difference which one you use. So from the question that we had about performance impact, there just really isn't any performance benefit to one or the other, unless you're doing something in a way trying to ninja your way out of something because of the way you architected it in components, class components versus hooks, or vice versa even. And you're ninjaing something away because you don't understand maybe how it's working, and you've created your own performance impact, right? But I think inherently there's no benefit performance-wise to one way or the other.
There's no framework that's going to help you fix bad code.
Well, that's good. I was like, why are you smirking? Oh, now I get it. Yeah.
And
bad code is never fixed by the framework. Right.
Is this going to make my code better? I'm going, I've seen your code. This isn't going to fix it. There's no magic button.
Yes. I have no idea what you're talking about. Never seen that.
One of the other questions that we saw that came up that you covered early on, though, that I think is worth kind of highlighting here, is that we had, this kind of came up a couple different times of like, why should you or should you not use hooks? I think we kind of answered that, where it's just kind of like, it really is up to you why you should or shouldn't use it. But the other one that I thought that I found people really getting wrapped around the axle on is, when should I use it? Our hooks are reusable for reusable things like a text box, or are they for entire components? Like a class would be for a dashboard or a page, but hooks, I wouldn't do that. Use it for smaller things. It's not like that. It's not like that. Yeah. To me, it's you're either using a class-based component or you're using a hook. The size of it is up to you. It doesn't matter. There's nothing. One is not better for, I don't think one is better for one situation or the other. In fact, if you and I were both working on a project, and if it's a SharePoint,
we'd have to pick one.
We'd have to pick one. But if it was like, Andrew, you're doing these three components, and Julie, you're doing these 3 components. You could do them as class components and I could do them as functional components. And you just say, here's how you use it. Here's the public signature of it. And you send it back to me. It's like,
oh, 100%. What I was going to say is hooks can have class components in it, but not the other way around. Because you can't use effects within a component, right?
It's all localized inside of the component itself, is my understanding. I haven't tried that. But I don't see why
told,
it wouldn't.
and since I haven't done it myself, I don't know this 100%, but I was told that if you have a child component that is using hooks, you can't use that in a class component. So like if your return method returned something that used hooks, it can't, that you can't do it that way. You can do it the other way, but you can't do it. We maybe should look into that. I don't, that's what I was told.
Maybe one of the listeners knows and they can tell us if they can say, drop a comment below.
I was just going to say, if you know the answer to that one, we want to hear about it. So drop it in the comment below. But to that point,
I haven't tried it because I'm
okay.
Like,
you're one or the other, right? Yeah.
I've already jumped off the deep end and I only do stuff with hooks now. I don't touch class components anymore. So I haven't tried to mix and match.
Yeah, it's interesting that the confusion about it too, because we've talked about it a little bit, but I do the H2O Fluent UI library with Stefan Bauer. He does the HTML and CSS core solution, but I do a React component version of the library or implementation of the library. And somebody reached out and asked why I didn't have a hooks version of it. I'm like, you don't need a hooks version. You can I have class components. That's how I write. They're all written as class components. You can just consume them in your React hooks solution. You don't have to convert them. And so that was like I think that's like you were saying right at the beginning. I think there's just like a general misconception sometimes about what hooks are about and where the shift got made.
I will say, and this is very much just me getting on the soapbox. Okay. But I will say that I think that React developers should at least give it a shot, because at least try using hooks for a project, or take an existing project and convert it to using hooks. Not a gigantic project, but choose something that's relatively, a modest size, and implement it using hooks and just do the exact same thing. No new functionality, exact same thing, and just see if you like it more. And the reason why I say that is because I think from my unprofessional opinion or unprofessional survey, error rate of, we're in the election season again, so error rate of 50, plus minus 50. That I think that most React stuff you see today are developers using hooks. Now, that very well could be that it's just that, hey, it's the new thing and everyone wants to use the new thing to show that they're cool. I don't think so. I think that I do think that, like, I drank the Kool-Aid and I still drink the Kool-Aid because I do think it's a better way of doing things. I'm not saying they're always bad. I just think it's a better way of doing it. Or I'm not saying that, I'm not saying anybody who's not doing it is bad. But the other thing I'm seeing is that stuff that is like other frameworks are built in the hook style way of doing things. So getting in that mindset, it's kind of like getting in the mindset of using callbacks, or getting in the mindset of using promises, that you want to be in that mindset. So like there's a web server. So if you do Node, if you do Java, if you do Node.js, there is a very popular web server called Express. Very lightweight Express web server to use to go through and implement a website using Node. And there is there's 2 popular new ones that have come onto the scene. One is called Next.js. The other one is called Remix. And Remix is basically like client server React. And the more I've played with it, the more I really, really like it, because it's like, whereas before I used to always, today when we build like a web app, you build the client side and then you build the server side when you have to get data from the server side. But it mixes the two to where there's like stuff built in where you have a hook called use loader, where it knows to go through that you can define and say, well, here's the data that this list display thing is going to have to serve up. And when I need the data, I just say like use loader. And so when it gets the data back, then I can go through and start doing stuff. But I define the function and how to go get all that data. I define it server side. So the data is fetched server side and I only get what I need. So I don't have to make those calls.
Oh, so instead of making an actual fetch call to a REST endpoint that you've redefined in a certain way, you're just saying use this function and that sits on the server.
It sits on the server and and Remix knows when it renders out the resulting code you're going to deploy, it adds the stuff that says, here's how you call that endpoint. And if it's a security endpoint, it knows how to go through and add all the headers and all that kind of stuff. It's much quicker. I played around with it for like a custom tab for Microsoft Teams. It was hard to kind of wire stuff because the current Yeoman generator for Teams is really hard coded to use Express. But it didn't take too much for me to throw all the Express stuff out or leverage the pieces that they did have and that I needed to be able to use Remix. Anyway, the reason why I say this though, is that when you use Remix, you definitely are in the hook style way of doing stuff. So
interesting.
Things it just seems like that's where React is going. And so it's kind of you might as well take a look at it because you may end up kind of being, if you're going to be a React developer, you may end up being forced in that direction for a while.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's super fair. Yep.
So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So let's see. What else did we get asked that we maybe didn't answer?
Why and why not use hooks? I think we got that.
Yeah, performance we talked about.
Yeah.
When to use. I think we sort of said it just depends on what you're going to use, right? And then
I think it doesn't matter. That's the thing. I think it's more like that's not a decision point.
Right, exactly. Cool. So I think we've really summed this whole thing up. What do you think?
I think so. And for those, I referenced the video that I did earlier in the blog post. There'll be notes and or links in the description below the video if you're interested in checking that out. What do you think of React hooks? Did we answer your question during the episode? Let us know and drop a comment below or submit a topic to discuss on future Cloud Dev Clarity episodes. And if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe by smashing that subscribe button below the video so that you can see when we publish more Cloud Dev Clarity episode videos for developers on Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Azure topics, including React hooks if you have any more ideas. Thanks. We'll see you next time.